All right, let's go. Number 10. Tutankhamun and the 18th Dynasty of Egypt. In the winter of 2005, a team of radiologists wheeled a portable CT scanner into the basement of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The task was routine by modern medical standards. Slide the body in, capture cross-sectional images, catalog the skeletal inventory. The body in question had been dead for approximately 3,300 years. What the scanner revealed was not a king preserved in golden perfection. It was a young man with a severe cleft palate, a clubbed left foot, a fractured left femur, and a degenerative bone disease in both feet so advanced that walking would have required a cane. More than 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb. They were not ceremonial. They were medical equipment. The golden death mask is the most recognized artifact in the history of archaeology. It shows a face of divine symmetry, a god made flesh. But the skeleton beneath that mask told a different story entirely. The cleft palate meant the king could not eat normally. The clubbed foot meant he limped from the day he could stand. Kolar disease had destroyed the bone tissue in both feet, turning every step into an exercise in managed pain. 130 walking sticks, placed in the tomb alongside golden chariots and jeweled pectorals, were not gifts for the afterlife. They were the tools a teenager needed to cross a room. The gap between the mask and the body beneath it is the gap between what a dynasty wanted to project and what it had actually produced. The most famous face in human history was a concealment device. The 18th dynasty did not set out to destroy itself. Each royal marriage was a theological act of preservation. The pharaoh was not a king in the modern sense, he was a living god, and divine blood could not be contaminated by mortal unions. Brother married sister because the gods had done the same. Osiris married Isis. The pattern was cosmic, and to deviate was not merely imprudent. It was sacrilege. But 5 generations of sibling and parent-child unions compressed the gene pool with terrifying efficiency. Each generation inherited fewer unique alleles. Each generation's immune system grew narrower, more fragile, less capable of responding to infection. The dynasty's strategy of divine purity manufactured its own biological failure. The logic is identical to modern closed breeding programs that produce show animals with beautiful coats and catastrophic joint disease. The aesthetic goal consumes the organism. The myth of Osiris and Isis provided the framework. The priests who maintained it were not fools. They were operating inside a system in which genetic health was invisible, and divine purity was the only metric that mattered. How does a civilization sustain a practice for generations when the evidence of its consequences is lying in the royal nursery? The question has no satisfying answer. The stillbirths were visible. The childhood deaths were documented. The deformities were present in the bodies the embalmers prepared. And the marriages continued, because the theological mandate was more real to them than the dead children it produced. Tutankhamen's tomb contained 2 small coffins. Inside them were 2 fetuses, both female, both stillborn. DNA analysis confirmed they were his daughters. One showed skeletal abnormalities consistent with severe genetic compromise. The dynasty's last viable male produced 2 children, and neither survived birth. After his death, the throne passed to non-royal officials. The 18th dynasty did not fall to invasion or rebellion. It simply stopped being able to reproduce. The nursery never held a living heir. The 2 small coffins were sealed alongside the king, as if the dynasty knew it was burying its future with its last son. In 2010, a DNA study led by Zahi Hawass and published in the Journal of the American Medical Association confirmed that Tutankhamen's parents were full siblings and that the king suffered from multiple disorders consistent with prolonged consanguinity. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The 18th dynasty was not ignorant of the consequences. Royal records show that stillbirths, childhood deaths, and physical deformities were common knowledge within the court. They continued anyway. The theological framework did not prevent them from seeing the damage. It prevented them from caring. They knew. The system was more important than the children it produced. 3,000 years later, the golden mask still covers the broken body. The most famous artifact in Egyptian archaeology is, at its core, a concealment device. An entire civilization's theology was built to justify a practice that was visibly destroying its ruling family, and the family chose the theology over its own survival. The mask remains. The dynasty is gone, The question is not why they did it. The question is whether a civilization that builds its identity around a beautiful lie can ever choose to stop. Before we continue to the next item, here's a little something for you. If you're the type of person who wants to keep learning but doesn't always have time to sit down and watch, we put all of our stuff on Spotify. That way your drive becomes a history lesson. Your evening walk becomes a trip through the dark ages. Even falling asleep becomes something worthwhile. And the best thing is that you can listen without any ads or interruptions. The link is right there in the comments section, and honestly, it might change how you spend your downtime. Alright, let's keep going with the next item. Number 9. The Sassanid Persians and Zoroastrian Xwedodah. In 1862, a German philologist named Martin Haug sat in a reading room at the University of Pune, translating a Pahlavi text that had survived the Arab conquest of Persia by over 1,000 years. The manuscript was a compilation of Zoroastrian religious guidance known as the Rivayat, and Haug had been working through its legal and liturgical prescriptions for weeks. Most of the material was familiar to scholars of Iranian religion, but midway through a passage on the accumulation of spiritual merit, Haug encountered a set of instructions that would haunt the field of Iranian studies for the next century and a half. The text did not merely permit marriage between close relatives. It prescribed it, father to daughter, brother to sister, mother to son, not as a concession to human weakness, but as the highest sacrament a Zoroastrian could perform. The practice was called Xwedodah, and it was not an aberration tolerated at the margins of Sassanid society. It was doctrine. The Zoroastrian text described next-of-kin marriage as an act capable of erasing past sins and guaranteeing passage across the Chinvat Bridge, the span between the world of the living and the realm of the blessed dead. A father who married his daughter performed an act of supreme piety. A brother who married his sister strengthened the cosmic order. The modern audience confronts this and searches for the familiar moral framework. It is not there. The framework is inverted. The act that most civilizations classify as the deepest violation was, in this theology, the highest virtue. The dissonance is not cultural. It is structural. The priestly class, the Magi, controlled the texts that mandated Xwedodah. The laity could not read Avestan. Theological interpretation was a monopoly, held by the very people whose institutional authority depended on the practice continuing. A Zoroastrian commoner could not challenge Xwedodah because the commoner could not access the source texts. The priests who enforced the doctrine were the only people qualified to interpret it. It was a closed loop. The knowledge was gate-kept by the gatekeepers, and the gate only opened inward. Sassanid kings weaponized the practice. By marrying within the royal house, they eliminated rival claimants and concentrated political authority. The theological mandate provided spiritual cover for what was functionally a power consolidation tool. Every generation the practice continued. The pool of legitimate heirs shrank, and the surviving line's grip on the throne tightened. The dynasty traded genetic breadth for political control, and for centuries, the trade appeared to work. The Arab conquest of the 7th century brought Islam, a faith that condemned consanguineous marriage and regarded Xwedodah with visceral horror. The Sassanid dynasty's theological foundation was not merely defeated on the battlefield. It was morally dismantled by a competing civilization that classified its most sacred practice as an abomination. Within 2 generations of the conquest, a religion that had been the state faith of an empire, stretching from modern Iraq to modern Afghanistan, was reduced to scattered communities. Zoroastrian texts describe Xwedodah in reverent, liturgical language. Arab historians describe it in language closer to forensic documentation of a crime. The same practice, recorded by 2 civilizations, reads as sacrament in one and atrocity in the other. Both accounts survive. Neither can be reconciled with the other. Modern genetic studies of Zoroastrian Parsi communities, including research at the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology in Hyderabad, have documented elevated rates of autosomal recessive disorders consistent with centuries of endogamous marriage practices descended from the Sassanid era. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Xwedodah did not end with the Arab conquest. It retreated. Zoroastrian communities carried the practice into exile, first into the remote mountains of Iran, then across the sea to India. The genetic signatures of prolonged endogamy persist in Parsi populations today. The dynasty collapsed in the 7th century. The doctrine survived. The genetic echo survived longer. A theology can outlive the civilization that invented it. The Sassanid Empire fell 1400 years ago. The genetic consequences of its most sacred doctrine are still measurable in living populations. Empires dissolve. Armies scatter. But a doctrine written into a sacred text, one that tells families how to structure their most intimate relationships, can outlast every other institution the civilization ever built. The dynasty is dust. The instruction remains. Number 8. The Medici of Florence. The skeletal age was 38. The chronological age was barely 15. In 2004, forensic anthropologist Gino Fornaciari at the University of Pisa opened a Medici tomb in the Basilica of San Lorenzo and extracted remains that should have belonged to a middle-aged laborer, not an adolescent heir to the most powerful banking family in Renaissance Europe. The bones showed rickets, advanced arthritis, and metabolic damage so severe that the skeleton had aged at more than twice the rate of the body it carried. Something in the Medici bloodline was consuming its children from the inside. The diseases Fornaciari found were not the diseases of poverty. Rickets in children who ate better than any family in Europe. Skeletal deformities in bodies that had access to the finest physicians on the continent. Gout in men who should have been decades away from it. The Medici lived in palaces, wore silk, dined on the best food available in the 15th century, and their bones looked like those of dock workers who had spent 40 years breaking their bodies for wages. Lead-glazed ceramics and heavy wine consumption compounded the damage, but the underlying pattern pointed somewhere else entirely. The narrowing gene pool had made the family fragile in ways that wealth could not mask and medicine could not explain. The Medici wealth machine was self-consuming. The banking network that funded their ascent also funded the marriages that narrowed their bloodline. Every political marriage was a transaction. Florence gained an alliance with a papal family or a French noble house. In return, the Medici gene pool received another dose of the same limited European aristocratic stock. The money that built their power was the same money that purchased their biological decline. Every marriage contract that expanded the dynasty's political reach contracted its genetic diversity. The pattern mirrors modern corporate mergers that consolidate market power while eliminating the internal variety that made the companies adaptable. Concentration creates dominance. Dominance creates fragility. The papacy became a family possession. Leo X. Clement VII. Catherine de' Medici as Queen of France. The family inserted itself into the highest institutions in Western civilization, but each insertion required a marriage, and each marriage drew from the same narrow pool. The institution grew. The bloodline shrank. The Medici sat on the throne of St. Peter, while their children died of diseases their physicians could not name. Fornaciari and his team physically opened tombs that had been sealed for centuries. The process of exhumation was itself a kind of archaeology of concealment. The marble sarcophagi were magnificent. The remains inside them were not. What the bones told the scientists was what the family's own portraits and biographies had spent generations omitting. The painted faces glowed with health, the skeletons told of chronic pain, metabolic failure, and bodies that broke down decades before they should have. The Medici invested in art, architecture, and cultural patronage on a scale that changed Western civilization. Botticelli, Michelangelo, the Uffizi Gallery. These investments were partly legacy insurance, a family that sensed its biological fragility building monuments that would outlast its blood. The last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, died in 1743. The Uffizi has been open continuously for over 450 years. The art has outlived the family by a factor of nearly 7. The name survives because of what they funded, not what they produced biologically. The bloodline ended. The gallery did not. Fornaciari's published findings from the Medici project documented rickets, arthritis, and skeletal evidence of metabolic syndrome across multiple generations, including in children under age 10. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Medici were not passive victims of ignorance. They employed the finest physicians in Europe. They documented births, deaths, and childhood illnesses with meticulous precision. The family archives show they tracked which children survived and which did not. They saw the pattern. They calculated that political power gained through marriage was worth more than the children lost to it. They did not fail to see. They saw. They chose the dynasty over the child. Every time. The Medici Chapel in Florence contains some of the most beautiful funerary sculpture ever carved. Michelangelo's figures of night and day sit above tombs that hold the broken remains of a family that purchased immortality in marble because it could not achieve it in blood. The sculptures are perfect. The bones beneath them are not. A dynasty that changed the course of Western art could not change the course of its own biology. The art endures. The family that made it possible does not. Number 7. The Inca Sapa Inca dynasty. On a hillside above Cusco in the late 1980s, a physical anthropologist was cataloging skeletal remains from an Inca-era burial complex. The work was methodical. Measure the cranium. Record the dental inventory. Note the condition of the long bones. The remains were from high-status individuals, their burial goods confirming elite rank, but the measurements kept producing anomalies. Cranial deformities that could not be explained by intentional shaping alone. Dental patterns that deviated sharply from the surrounding commoner population. Growth disruptions written into bone that should have belonged to the best-fed people in the empire. Something had gone wrong at the top. The founding myth established the mandate. Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, brother and sister, emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca as children of the sun god Inti. The solar bloodline was literal, not metaphorical. The Sapa Inca was the sun made flesh, and only a sister wife, a Koya, could preserve the divine lineage without contamination. At some point, the founding myth hardened into a breeding mandate. When exactly that transition occurred is uncertain. What is certain is that by the height of the empire, brother-sister marriage at the royal level was not optional. It was theologically compulsory. The question of whether anyone in the early dynasty foresaw the consequences has no satisfying answer. The doctrine was cosmic. The consequences were biological. The two operated on different timescales, and by the time the biology became undeniable, the doctrine was immovable. The children born of these unions paid the price. Skeletal evidence from royal and elite Inca burials shows cranial deformities, dental anomalies, and growth disruption at rates far exceeding those found in the commoner population. The bodies of the highest-born children carried the signature of a narrowing gene pool. They could not refuse their parentage. They inherited a biology assembled by theology, and no amount of gold or ritual could repair what the genome had produced. Among known royal Inca children, the proportion who did not survive to adulthood was dramatically higher than among commoner families. The holiest children in the empire were also the most fragile. The practice was exclusively royal. Commoners were forbidden from sibling marriage. The divine bloodline was simultaneously the dynasty's greatest theological asset and its biological death sentence, reserved only for those born at the very top. A farmer's children in the provinces were healthier than the god king's children in Cusco. The empire's lowest subjects were biologically more viable than its highest rulers. The class divide did not just separate rich from poor, it separated the genetically viable from the genetically condemned. And the condemned were the ones wearing gold. Tawantinsuyu stretched 4,000 kilometers along the spine of South America, roughly the distance from London to Baghdad. Roads, relay stations, and Quipu record systems all fed back to a central authority that required a functioning succession at its center. When the bloodline faltered, the infrastructure did not compensate. It amplified the failure. Huayna Capac's death, possibly from a European disease that reached the empire before the Europeans themselves, triggered a civil war between his sons Atahualpa and Huascar. The possibility that generations of consanguinity had already weakened the dynasty's capacity to produce stable, unified leadership hung over the crisis. Pizarro arrived not at the height of an empire, but at its fracture point. The roads that had carried messages across 4,000 kilometers fell silent. The relay runners stopped. The empire's nervous system went dark. Research by physical anthropologists examining Inca-era skeletal remains from elite burial sites near Cusco has documented elevated rates of cranial and dental anomalies in royal burials compared to commoner populations, consistent with sustained consanguineous marriage within the ruling lineage. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Pizarro did not conquer a functioning empire. He arrived at the wreckage of a civil war between two half-brothers, fighting over a throne their bloodline could barely sustain. The dynasty had been fracturing from within for generations, before the first Spanish boot touched Andean soil. The comfortable story of European technological superiority obscures a deeper collapse. The empire's own bloodline was the first conqueror. 4,000 kilometers of roads, bridges, and relay stations. One of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian world, held together by a single family whose theology required it to destroy itself. The sun was the source of the dynasty's power and the engine of its annihilation. A god-king's blood had to remain pure. Pure blood produced broken heirs. Broken heirs could not hold the empire. The children of the sun did not endure. The sun, as the theology promised, did. Number 6. The House of Aviz, Portugal. In 1845, a Portuguese archivist named Alexandre Herculano was working through the Royal Chronicle collections at the Torre do Tombo, Portugal's national archive in Lisbon. Herculano was assembling material for a comprehensive history of Portuguese independence, and the documents he needed were routine: tax records, diplomatic correspondence, church registries. But buried among the administrative records of the late 16th century, he found something that would reshape Portuguese historiography for the next century. The documents surrounding King Sebastian I did not describe a hero undone by ambition. They described a pattern, a dynasty-wide pattern of erratic judgment, obsessive religiosity, and reproductive failure that stretched back generations before Sebastian was born. The crusade that killed him was not the cause of the dynasty's collapse. It was the final symptom. The House of Aviz began in illegitimacy. João I, its founder, was the bastard son of Pedro I. He seized the throne in a revolution and built a global maritime empire. Portuguese ships reached West Africa, India, Brazil, and China within a century of his reign. But the same narrow aristocratic pool that produced the dynasty's greatest navigators also narrowed with each generation. The marriages that secured alliances with Castile, Aragon, and the great families of Iberia folded the same bloodlines back into each other. The question is not whether the narrowing produced consequences, it is when the consequences became visible in the behavior of the kings themselves. August 4, 1578. The Moroccan Desert. The sun at its zenith. King Sebastian I of Portugal led roughly 17,000 soldiers into battle at Alcácer Quibir, a crusade launched against the unanimous advice of his most experienced military commanders. The Moroccan forces outnumbered the Portuguese significantly. The heat was devastating. The logistics were catastrophic. By nightfall, approximately 8,000 Portuguese soldiers were dead or captured. The flower of Portuguese aristocracy, an entire generation of nobility, was gone in hours. Sebastian himself vanished in the fighting. His body was never conclusively identified. The silence that followed in Lisbon, when the news finally arrived, was the silence of a nation realizing that its king, its army, and its future had disappeared into the same afternoon. Sebastian died without an heir. The throne passed to his great-uncle, the aging Cardinal Henry, who died 2 years later. Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese crown. 60 years of Spanish rule followed. The Portuguese trade networks that had taken a century to build, the routes to India, the Brazilian colonies, the African posts, were subordinated to Spanish interests. An empire assembled over 4 generations was dismantled because one dynasty could not produce a functional successor. The pattern is identical to a family business built over generations and lost in a single succession failure. The architecture survives, the family does not. In the decades after Alcácer Quibir, at least 4 impostors appeared claiming to be Sebastian. The Sebastianist movement, a messianic belief that the king would return to restore Portugal's glory, persisted for centuries. A dynasty so inbred it could not produce a stable heir also could not produce a verifiable corpse. The absence of a body became more powerful than any body could have been. The inability to confirm the king's death transformed a dynastic failure into a theological crisis that burned in the Portuguese imagination for 300 years. The nation waited. The king did not return. Historians including Queiroz Velloso have documented that Sebastian's obsessive crusading zeal, his refusal to marry, and his erratic judgment align with behavioral patterns observed in other European dynasties with sustained consanguinity. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Sebastian was not an isolated case. The House of Aviz had been producing increasingly erratic rulers for generations. His great-grandfather, Manuel I, exhibited grandiose religious fixations. The pattern of impaired judgment, obsessive piety, and reproductive failure was not a single aberration. It was a trajectory. The crusade was not the cause of the dynasty's collapse. It was the final expression of a bloodline that had been narrowing toward this exact catastrophe for over a century. Portugal waited for Sebastian to return, for decades, for centuries. A dynasty that destroyed itself through biological narrowing became, in death, the object of a national faith that its survival would have extinguished. The king was more powerful as a ghost than he had ever been as a ruler. The body was never found. The belief never died. A bloodline that could not produce a living heir produced something no living heir could have, an immortal absence at the center of a nation's identity. Number 5. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria, 46 years. That is how long Otto I of Bavaria spent confined to a room, declared legally insane, nominally king of a country he was never permitted to govern. He assumed the title in 1886. He held it until 1913. In nearly 3 decades on the throne, he never signed a document, never held an audience, never appeared in public. He was king in name and prisoner in fact, and the dynasty that produced him had been manufacturing this outcome for generations. The number is not an anomaly. It is a duration. 46 years of confinement exceeds the average lifespan of most Europeans born in the same century. Otto outlived his own relevance by a margin that should have been impossible. Ludwig II descended first. The midnight sleigh rides alone through the Bavarian Alps. The refusal to hold court or meet with ministers. The conversations with imaginary guests at banquets set for people who did not exist. Plates were filled, chairs were pulled out, servants waited on empty seats while the king addressed companions no one else could see. The dissolution was not sudden. It accumulated. Each year the isolation deepened. Each year the distance between the king's inner world and the outer one widened. His brother Otto had already been confined for mental illness years before Ludwig's own crisis. The dynasty did not produce deformed bodies. It produced fractured minds. The horror was internal, invisible, felt rather than seen, and it was not confined to one generation. It echoed forward and backward through the family tree like a sound that would not stop reverberating. The castles told the story the court tried to suppress. Neuschwanstein, perched on a cliff face in the Bavarian Alps, was designed not by an architect, but by a theatrical set painter named Christian Jonck. It was a medieval fantasy built with industrial-age engineering, a structure that served no military, governmental, or residential purpose. Linderhof was modeled on Versailles. Herrenchiemsee was an incomplete replica of the Hall of Mirrors, abandoned when the money ran out. These buildings were physically magnificent and functionally purposeless. They were not designed for governance. They were projections of a mind that had retreated entirely into fantasy, a mind assembled from a gene pool that had been folding in on itself for generations. The buildings survive. Millions visit them annually. The mind that built them was declared legally insane before the last one was finished. In June of 1886, the Bavarian government deposed Ludwig. A panel of 4 physicians declared him insane without ever conducting a personal examination. They relied on testimony from servants and courtiers. 3 days later, Ludwig was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg alongside his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. The circumstances have never been conclusively explained. The institution that the Wittelsbach dynasty had built to serve its rule became the instrument that ended it. The government removed a king whose bloodline had produced exactly the kind of ruler that bloodline was always going to produce. The machinery of the state consumed the family that created it. Neuschwanstein Castle became the visual template for Disneyland's Sleeping Beauty Castle. Walt Disney visited it in the 1950s, and its silhouette became the most reproduced castle image on Earth. Billions of people have seen it on screen, on merchandise, at theme parks on 4 continents. A structure born from the visions of a clinically insane king, funded by a bankrupted kingdom, produced by a dynasty that married too closely for too long, became the global symbol of fairy tale monarchy. The recognition does the work. The fairy tale was never a fairy tale. The Wittelsbach intermarriages were designed to consolidate Bavarian sovereignty. The dynasty married within its own network and within the broader German aristocratic pool to prevent absorption by Austria or Prussia. The result was the opposite. Rulers incapable of governing necessitated regents and advisors who increasingly answered to Berlin. Bavaria's strategy of protecting its independence through bloodline purity accelerated its dependence on the very powers it was trying to resist. By 1871, Bavaria was absorbed into the German Empire under Prussian leadership. The biological strategy of independence produced political submission. Psychiatric historian Dr. Heinz Hafner documented a statistically elevated incidence of mental illness across multiple Wittelsbach generations, with at least 7 family members in the 19th century alone exhibiting symptoms consistent with severe psychiatric disorders. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Ludwig was not an eccentric genius. He was not a tragic romantic. He was a data point. His brother was confined. His cousin exhibited erratic behavior. Multiple relatives across several generations showed psychiatric symptoms that cluster in a pattern no geneticist would call coincidental. The castles were not visionary architecture. They were diagnostic artifacts. Every turret was a symptom. The most photographed castle in the world exists because a dynasty married too closely for too many generations. The fairy tale millions of children absorb, the spires, the turrets, the impossible beauty, is a monument to genetic collapse. Ludwig built a fantasy because reality had become intolerable to a mind his bloodline had made incapable of inhabiting it. The castle endures because it is beautiful. The dynasty ended because beauty was all it could produce. The mind breaks, the stone remains. Number 4. The Hawaiian Ali'i. In the early 1820s, a New England missionary named Hiram Bingham arrived on the island of Oahu and began the long, painstaking process of transcribing Hawaiian oral traditions into written English. The work was linguistic, it was administrative, it was, by the standards of missionary activity, routine. But as Bingham recorded the genealogical chants of the Hawaiian Ali'i, the ruling chiefs, the structure of what he was hearing began to reveal something the chants themselves treated as sacred, and the missionary could only process as disturbing. The genealogies did not branch. They braided. Brother married sister. Half-siblings married half-siblings. The family tree was not a tree at all. It was a rope, twisted tighter with each generation, and the knots were theological. The concept of mana drove everything. Mana was sacred spiritual power, concentrated through unions between individuals of the highest rank. A child born of a brother-sister union among the highest ali'i possessed a mana so intense that commoners could not look at them directly. The Niaupio, the children of the most sacred unions, were so charged with spiritual power that they could only go outside at night, because their shadow falling across a commoner was considered dangerous. The theology was not a justification layered on top of the marriages. It was a cosmology in which the holiest possible child was the one most likely to be biologically compromised. The highest spiritual rank and the highest genetic risk occupied the same body. The sacred and the fragile were identical. The kahuna, the priestly specialists, maintained the genealogical chants that determined rank and mana. These chants were not written, they were memorized and performed across generations. The kahuna were the only people who could calculate the mana of a proposed union, the only ones who could authorize or prohibit a royal marriage. Their authority depended entirely on the continuation of the system. They were gatekeepers whose institutional survival required the perpetuation of the practice that was destroying the bloodline they served. The knowledge was oral, exclusive, and self-reinforcing. No one outside the priestly class could challenge the system, because no one outside the priestly class had access to the information that defined it. The mana system was designed to elevate the ali'i above all others. It succeeded theologically. It failed biologically. The highest-ranking chiefs, the products of the most concentrated unions, showed evidence of reduced fertility, elevated infant mortality, and physical conditions consistent with severe inbreeding depression. The system designed to make them more than human made them less viable than any commoner in the kingdom. The theological apex was the biological nadir. How does a culture sustain a system in which holiness and fragility are genetically identical, and the evidence of failure is born in the royal nursery with every generation? The question sits at the center of the Hawaiian Ali'i story, and no answer resolves it. The Ali'i faced an impossible theological bind. Marrying outside the highest ranks diluted mana. That was a spiritual catastrophe that diminished the chief's authority, their connection to the gods, and the cosmic order itself. Marrying within the highest ranks destroyed the body. There was no third option. The culture had constructed a cage in which the only pious choice was the one that guaranteed extinction. Every marriage was a sacrifice. Every child was an experiment. And the kahuna who authorized each union knew the pattern as well as anyone. They chose the theology. Every time. Anthropological analysis by Patrick Kirch at the University of California, Berkeley documented patterns of demographic decline in the highest-ranking Ali'i lineages consistent with severe inbreeding depression, accelerating in the generations immediately preceding Western contact. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The demographic collapse of the highest Ali'i lineages was already well underway before Captain Cook's ships appeared on the horizon in 1778. Western contact did not end the practice. It arrived at a bloodline that was already failing. The highest-ranking Ali'i were not saved by the arrival of outsiders. They were already past saving. The theology had run its course. The biology had rendered its verdict. The Hawaiian Ali'i built a theology in which the closest possible union produced the holiest possible child. They followed it faithfully for generations, and the theology kept its promise. The children born of the highest unions were sacred beyond measure. They were also too fragile to survive. A civilization that engineered divinity in its rulers engineered extinction in the same breath. The manna was real to them. The fragility was real to everyone. A culture can worship its own destruction, call it piety, mean it, and never know until the last sacred child does not survive the night. Number 3. The Ptolemaic Dynasty of Egypt. In 2011, a geneticist at the University of Athens named Eris Poulakou Rebelakou attempted to diagram the Ptolemaic family tree for a research paper on historical inbreeding. The project should have been straightforward. Draw the lines of descent, connect the marriages, map 15 generations. But the diagram kept collapsing. Lines that should have branched outward folded back inward. The same individuals appeared in multiple positions on the chart simultaneously, as both uncle and father, as both cousin and brother. After weeks of work, the resulting diagram did not resemble a tree. It resembled a braid, a single twisted cord of genetic material, looped back through itself so many times that the software could not render it cleanly. The Ptolemaic court bureaucracy maintained sibling marriage across nearly 300 years, roughly 15 generations. That is longer than the United States has existed as a nation. This was not the passion of individual kings. It was institutional policy. Court officials, priests, and administrators facilitated, documented, and legitimized each union. The system had inertia that outlasted any individual ruler's judgment. Generations of bureaucrats processed the paperwork for marriages they may or may not have believed in. The institution did not need belief. It needed compliance. And compliance, once embedded in administrative routine, is almost impossible to dislodge. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks ruling an Egyptian population. Sibling marriage served three purposes simultaneously. It eliminated rival claimants by keeping the bloodline closed. It preserved the Greek ethnic identity of the ruling house in a land where they were foreign. And it echoed the pharaonic traditions of their Egyptian subjects, lending legitimacy to a dynasty that might otherwise have been dismissed as occupiers. Biology was sacrificed for a political architecture so effective it held together for 3 centuries. Every generation, the dynasty chose political survival over genetic health. Every generation, the trade appeared to work, until it did not. Roman and Greek observers documented the decline in real time. Polybius described the early Ptolemies with respect. By the later dynasty, the tone had shifted. Ptolemy VIII was described by Roman visitors as so physically grotesque and so unstable in temperament that foreign envoys struggled to maintain diplomatic composure in his presence. The sources read like a slow-motion medical record, written by people who did not have the vocabulary for what they were witnessing, but could see that something was going terribly wrong. The historical record across the dynasty's lifespan shifts from admiration to clinical horror, as if the observers were watching a family disintegrate over centuries, too slowly for any single generation to sound the alarm, too fast for the final generation to stop. Then Cleopatra VII. After nearly 3 centuries of genetic compression, the dynasty produced one of the most capable political operators, linguists, and diplomatic strategists in the ancient world. She spoke 9 languages. She managed simultaneous alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the 2 most powerful men on earth. She was, by any measure, brilliant. The comfortable assumption that inbreeding always produces decline is demolished by her existence. She should not have been possible, but she was also the last. The dynasty's most competent product was the one who could not prevent its annihilation. Rome did not destroy a weakened house. It destroyed the strongest Ptolemaic generations, and the bloodline ended anyway. Puliku Rebeliku's analysis calculated that by the dynasty's final generations, the Ptolemaic inbreeding coefficient had reached levels comparable to those documented in the Spanish Habsburgs, despite the dynasty's remarkable political longevity. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The dynasty did not decline steadily. It declined, and then, impossibly, it produced Cleopatra. The trajectory was not a smooth downward curve. It was a collapse interrupted by an anomaly so dramatic that it challenges the entire framework. If inbreeding always destroys, Cleopatra should not have existed. She did, and she still could not save the dynasty. The bloodline's greatest product and its extinction occupied the same generation. 3 centuries of sibling marriage, 15 generations of genetic compression, and at the end, a woman brilliant enough to nearly outmaneuver Rome. Nearly. The Ptolemaic dynasty did not end because it produced weak rulers. It ended because even its strongest ruler was not strong enough to overcome what 3 centuries of biology had built. Cleopatra was the exception that proved the rule. And the rule won. A bloodline can produce brilliance and extinction in the same breath. The genius does not redeem the system. The system consumes the genius. The dynasty lasted 300 years. Its most capable ruler lasted 39. Number 2. Queen Victoria's Hemophilia network. At least 6 European thrones. That is how many royal houses carried the hemophilia gene by the early 20th century. Britain, Russia, Spain, Germany, and several smaller principalities, all connected by marriage alliances that radiated outward from a single woman at Buckingham Palace. 6 thrones. 1 mutation. The number arrives before its meaning, because the meaning is too large to absorb without the number first. A single mutation in Queen Victoria. From there, through carefully arranged royal marriages, the hemophilia gene traveled across the continent. Every line on the genealogical chart that represented a political alliance also represented a delivery route for a bleeding disorder that would kill children, destabilize governments, and contribute to the fall of at least one empire, one woman, one spontaneous genetic event, or possibly one inherited from a source the royal family has never permitted anyone to investigate, a continent of consequences. The royal families knew. They watched sons bleed internally from minor bumps and falls. They watched grandsons die in childhood from injuries that any commoner child would have survived without medical attention. They documented the pattern. They consulted physicians who could offer no treatment and no cure. And they continued the marriage alliances anyway. Every betrothal of a known carrier was a conscious decision that dynastic strategy outweighed biological survival. They did not fail to respond. They responded by calculating that the dynasty was worth more than the child. The same calculation made by every family in this countdown. The system above the child. Every time. Tsarevich Alexei, the only son of Tsar Nicholas II, was a hemophiliac. His condition opened the door to Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic who appeared to ease the boy's bleeding episodes through methods no physician could explain or replicate. Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina Alexandra, and through her over the Russian government, destabilized the court, eroded public confidence in the monarchy, and contributed to the conditions that produced the 1917 revolution. One child's bruises opened a door that led to the fall of an empire of 170 million people. The scale translation is almost too large to hold. A boy who could not stop bleeding helped create the political conditions that led to the deaths of millions across the Revolution and the Civil War that followed. Victoria herself never exhibited symptoms. The mutation was either spontaneous in her or inherited from an undocumented source. If spontaneous, it was a random act of molecular chance that reshaped European history. If inherited, it raises questions about Victoria's paternity that the British royal family has never permitted genetic testing to resolve. The most consequential mutation in modern European history has no verified point of origin. The test that could answer the question has never been allowed. The gap in the record exists not because the evidence is lost, but because the institution has chosen not to look. Hemophilia affected commoners too, but commoners did not marry strategically across national borders. A hemophiliac baker's son bled and died in one village, and the tragedy stayed there. A hemophiliac prince bled and destabilized a continent. The disease did not discriminate by class. The marriage system did. And the marriage system turned a private medical condition into a continental political crisis. The monarchy's defining practice, marrying for alliance rather than compatibility, was the delivery mechanism for its own destruction. Every couple today who receives genetic screening before having a child is participating in a medical practice that traces its institutional origins to the documentation of hemophilia in European royal families. The entire field of reproductive genetic counseling exists because Victoria's descendants bled. The ancient royal disease, formalized and democratized, is now a routine part of modern prenatal care. The mutation is still here. It is just managed now by a system the mutation itself forced into existence. DNA analysis published in 2009 by geneticist Evgeny Rogaev at the University of Massachusetts Medical School confirmed through testing of Romanov remains that the mutation was hemophilia B, a factor IX deficiency, resolving a century-old debate. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The mutation did not destroy the thrones. The marriage system did. The mutation was random. The delivery mechanism was deliberate. Every royal marriage that carried the gene across a border was a political decision made by people who understood the risk. The hemophilia did not infiltrate the monarchies. The monarchies imported it, voluntarily, because the system that defined their power was the same system that distributed the disease. The families knew. They could not stop. Stopping would have meant abandoning the institution of royal intermarriage, which was the only thing that made them royal. One woman, one mutation, 6 thrones, a revolution, an empire of 170 million people destabilized in part because a boy could not stop bleeding. The monarchies of Europe were not destroyed by democracy alone, or industrialization, or ideology. They were destroyed, in part, by their own defining institution. The practice that made them powerful, marrying within the network, was the practice that distributed the weapon that unmade them. The gene did not care about alliances. The alliances did not care about the gene. The system that built the thrones was the system that bled them dry. The mutation was random. Everything that followed was a choice. There is a pattern now. 10 bloodlines, 10 theologies, 10 political architectures, 10 systems of marriage designed to concentrate power. Every one of them made the same calculation. The system was worth more than the child. The theological mandate, the political alliance, the concentration of divine or royal authority, all of it was judged more important than the bodies it produced. The pattern is not cultural. It is not limited to one religion, one continent, or one century. It is structural. Any system that values its own perpetuation above the health of the individuals who carry it will eventually consume those individuals. The only question is how many generations the consumption takes. Number 1. The Spanish Habsburgs and Charles II of Spain. In a quiet gallery of the Museo del Prado in Madrid, a portrait hangs that most visitors walk past without stopping. It shows a man with an elongated face, a jaw so distended it does not close properly, heavy-lidded eyes that seem to focus on nothing in particular, and a body that appears simultaneously aged and infantile. The painting is not unflattering. It is clinical. It is, in oil on canvas, a medical record. The artist did not exaggerate. Court painters of the Spanish Habsburgs were instructed to soften, to dignify, to idealize. This was the softened version. The man in the portrait was Charles II of Spain, and the jaw that dominates the painting is the most famous skeletal deformity in the history of European monarchy. The Habsburg jaw. Mandibular prognathism, worsening with each generation, visible in every royal portrait from the 15th century onward. Uncle married niece. Cousin married cousin. The marriages were not accidents of limited options. They were deliberate, calculated, and repeated across 2 centuries. A genetic analysis led by Gonzalo Alvarez at the University of Santiago de Compostela in 2009 examined over 3,000 individuals across 16 Habsburg generations and calculated Charles II's inbreeding coefficient at 0.254. In a normal outbred population, that number is effectively 0. Charles's value meant that more than a quarter of his genome consisted of identical allele copies inherited from both parents. His body was, genetically, a hall of mirrors. Every gene reflected back on itself. There was almost no diversity left to draw on. What daily life was like for Charles II defies comfortable description. He did not walk until age 8. He could not chew his own food because his jaw was too deformed to close properly. His tongue was so large relative to his mouth that his speech was nearly unintelligible. He was described by court observers as simultaneously senile and infantile. He appeared elderly before reaching middle age. He suffered from chronic intestinal ailments, frequent seizures, and episodes his physicians could neither diagnose nor treat. The king of the most powerful empire on earth could not feed himself. He could not make himself understood. He could not produce an heir. The body that was supposed to carry the dynasty forward could barely carry itself through a single day. The Spanish court organized itself entirely around concealment. Physicians examined Charles and documented his conditions in private records the public never saw. Wet nurses fed him until an age long past infancy. Courtiers managed audiences so that the king's incapacity was visible to as few foreign observers as possible. The private chambers smelled of illness. The sounds of a man struggling to eat carried through rooms designed for ceremony. The most powerful court in the Western world functioned as both throne room and sick room. The throne where the king rarely sat. The banquets he could not attend. The military campaigns he could not lead. The heirs he could not produce. The silences accumulated until they were louder than anything the court could say. 2 marriages, Maria Luisa of Orleans and then Maria Anna of Neuburg. Neither produced children. The court's physicians could not diagnose the cause, though the cause was visible in every mirror in the palace. The court turned to exorcism. Charles was subjected to religious rituals designed to expel the demonic forces his advisors believed were responsible for his condition. The institution that had created the problem through 2 centuries of strategic intermarriage attributed the result to Satan rather than acknowledge what everyone in the room could see. The exorcism was not medieval ignorance. It was institutional denial dressed in ecclesiastical vestments. The parallel to any institution that attributes systemic failure to external forces rather than examine its own structure is not subtle, it is exact. Charles died on November 1, 1700. The autopsy reportedly described a body with a single shriveled testicle, a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, intestines that were gangrenous, a head full of water, and 3 stones in his kidney. Whether every detail is accurate is debated. What followed is not. The Spanish Habsburg line ended. Completely. Permanently. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted, involving most of the major powers of Europe, lasting 13 years, and killing an estimated 700,000 people. 700,000 dead in a war fought to determine who would inherit a throne that was empty because a dynasty had refined its own bloodline into biological impossibility. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Habsburgs were not passive victims of a practice they did not understand. The pattern of deformity, illness, and reproductive failure was visible for generations. The Habsburg jaw was literally visible in every royal portrait. They painted the evidence on canvas and hung it on the walls of their own palaces. They watched their children die in infancy at rates far exceeding the general population. And they continued, generation after generation, because the alternative, marrying outside the family, would have diluted the political claim that made them the most powerful dynasty in Europe. They did not fail to see the pattern. They saw it. They chose the throne over the child, and the throne consumed them. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty spent 2 centuries refining its own bloodline. The blood was kept pure. And the last king it produced was a man who could not chew, could not speak clearly, could not produce an heir, and whose autopsy revealed organs that had never fully formed. The dynasty did not fall to war. It did not fall to revolution. It did not fall to plague or invasion or economic collapse. It fell to itself. The bloodline was the weapon and the bloodline was the victim. 2 centuries of strategic marriage designed to concentrate power in a single family concentrated pathology instead. The power dispersed across Europe in a war that killed 700,000 people. The pathology died with Charles in a bed in Madrid. A dynasty that believed its blood was too precious to share discovered that it was too damaged to continue. The knowledge was never absent. It was simply worth less than the crown. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.